the fact that these big NGOs, climate NGOs, I don't call them environmental groups anymore because I don't think they're environmentalists. If they were, they wouldn't be promoting this landscape destroying, viewshed destroying sprawl that comes with wind and solar. But those are elitists. And I say that word with no joy, but it's the right word. They get all their money from the other people who live in the cities. Their supporters aren't in rural areas. And so it is a land grab. I mean, that's in fact what it is. And it is a land grab by big in many cases, multinational corporations against small town America and trying to force them to accept wind and solar projects that they don't want.
My name is Max Gagliardi, and this is Always Be Building. If you're watching this episode, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app. If you left a review on Apple Podcasts, that would help the channel. Thanks to everybody who stuck around for this rebrand. For those of you that were here for the energy-only content, you're going to be very excited for this episode. I had Robert Bryce on, the author of multiple books in the energy industry that are amazing. His most recent one, A Question of Power, is one that I really enjoyed. He also has the Power Hungry podcast and a ton of other great content out there. If you haven't heard of Robert, this episode is going to be an absolute delight for you. If you have heard of him and enjoy his content, I think you're going to like it as well. Thank you guys so much and hope you enjoy the show. Robert, thanks for coming on the show. Glad you could make it.
Thanks. Glad to be with you, Max.
You're a longtime energy content creator, somebody that's been doing the world of traditional content and media, like the books that you've written, which are very good. And then you've really leaned in. You've got the Power Hungry podcast on the leaned in on the technology side. You've got the Power Hungry podcast. You're doing all kinds of great clips. Just starting off for people that I think a lot of people probably know you that are in my audience, but just a little bit of your background, and then we'll get into some of this content stuff here in a second.
Sure. Well, I have guests on my podcast introduce themselves, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Robert Bryce. First things first, I'm a proud dad and a proud husband. My wife Lauren and I are together for over 40 years now. We got 3 great kids, Mary, Michael, and Jacob, and we're crazy proud of them. They're all grown and out of the house. Empty nest. Oh, it's such a beautiful thing. So those are the important things in my life. The most important things in my family. I'm an author. I'm a journalist. I consider myself a reporter. That's what I think about. When I think about who I am, what I do for a profession, I'm a reporter. I report on the energy and power businesses. I have a podcast. I've written 6 books. Made 1 film, Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. I'm making another documentary called Burning Down the Grid. I love what I do. I'm passionate about these issues, and I consider myself incredibly fortunate. So how's that for
it's fantastic. I love how you started with the family stuff. I've got 3 kids as well, although they're far from empty nesters yet, but time is going by quickly.
It's great, Max. It is so good. I got to tell you, the empty nest thing, it's so good. It's a beautiful thing.
I don't know what I would do with myself. Honestly, I don't know what I do with myself.
You'll figure it out. Trust me.
Yeah. Putting out a lot of fires, at this stage on a day-to-day basis. But
of course,
my background, I've been in the energy industry, but have been leaning in more on doing content. Had the Talk Energy podcast, which is, we recently went through a rebrand. I don't know if I told you this. Now it's more broad. I've renamed the podcast Always Be Building. And I think energy is kind of the building blocks of life. Plus, I just had been interviewing 1 to 2 energy people per week for 2 years, 161 episodes. So I'm just like doing 50 to 60% energy now, right, and kind of just like branching out a little bit. But I'm also passionate about the energy industry, and I've worked in it on the natural gas side primarily. And then the content side, I think that the educational aspect of energy is poor broadly. I think broadly it needs more people like you that are doing the work that you're doing. And just as you went from you said, a journalist, somebody that's reporting on the energy industry, and then to doing the books, how have you been in terms of evolving? Like, how's this evolved for you? Because when I see what you're doing now, I'm like, man, this guy is incredibly, you're doing like TikToks every day, basically on LinkedIn and stuff like that. I feel like you've really leaned in, you've got the traditional media, and you've evolved with all the digital stuff and doing the documentaries, but just talk about that evolution and how you've maintained keeping it so fresh for so many years.
Well, thanks. I'm flattered that you say that, heartened. I will give a lot of credit to my daughter, Mary. She's our oldest. And last summer she said, Dad, hashtag real talk. We need to talk. You need to start doing these short videos and get on TikTok. And so our first our first idea was, we'll do these short videos, and I call them about a minute, and they're always under 2 minutes, because that's the cutoff for Twitter. For any video you put on Twitter, if it's longer than 2 minutes, you have
Right.
to put it on another platform and then link. So our first focus was TikTok rather. And we thought that was what would be where the growth is, but it hasn't been that way. And I don't know whether I'm shadow banned on TikTok or whatever, because I talked about Chinese solar panels or something. And they,
Sure.
I don't know. I don't really care, but
I got one removed recently off TikTok because talking about China stuff. We can get to that in a minute, but go ahead.
yeah. So I'm posting on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and something else.
TikTok.
Yeah, TikTok. Thank you. So, but I'm really getting good traction on both LinkedIn and Twitter, and kind of surprisingly and gratifying that it's getting that kind of traction. And they're also fun and challenging for me, because I've done a lot of television. I've been in front of, I've done many TV shows, and my first documentary, Juice, I'm on camera a lot, and on the podcast, I'm on camera a lot. But it's a real challenge to try and talk about some issue of the moment and do it in 2 minutes and do it cogently. And so that's been a fun challenge, and I've been gratified by the reception. But more broadly, you asked about my evolution of my own work, and I think I realized, well, I do have to get on these other platforms. What do I want my work to be seen? I don't want to write for myself. I don't want to write for my family. I want to get as big an audience as I can. So that was incumbent on me to modify my content strategy. And so it seems to be working. And the other part, I think, is just kind of the broad trend that I've been focused on. Started more focused on traditional energy and oil and gas with my book on Enron. And now I'm very much focused on electricity, because this is the world's most important and fastest growing form of energy. And it is the key differential between the rich countries and the poor countries. So those are the two, kind of broadly in terms of the focus of my work and how it's changed, those would be the, changing my content strategy, and having fun with it and doing the podcast. And then the other is more of a shift toward power away from traditional energy.
Do you find, this is just more for me, because these are the questions that I think about, and we'll get into more meat and potatoes here in a second, but on the short form content, are you seeing the views on that replicating or doing even better than like the long form podcast? Because I've noticed that mine sometimes get orders of magnitude more views or listens on a 60-second clip than on a long form podcast. And I think that's to what your daughter was saying, just people's attention spans, things like that. I'm just curious if you're seeing that.
No, that's been one of the interesting things. And, I try not to, Max, I think I write for myself. I work for my content is, does this sound good to me? Right. Does this make sense to me?
Right.
And I'm the first listener. Right. But the Twitter response, I did a video on the energy Wende in Germany that I released in December. It had something like 80,000 views on Twitter.
Wow.
It's just this one little 2 minute, minute and a half video I did on the cost of the energy Wende. I did one on Pakistan the other day, and the blackouts in Pakistan last week. It had 12,000 views on Twitter. Well, so that's a lot. For me anyway, Joe Rogan, maybe not, or Jordan Peterson or someone else like that. But to me, that's gratifying. And it's kind of scratches the itch to say, it's a little bit of encouragement to say, well, you're on the right track. You're hitting a niche that no one else is doing. And that's exciting to me. And all I'm doing is just to have this, here's my kit, right? The little ring light, the iPhone, and a monopod. And so this is no fancy production values. This is just me standing on my deck, or where I am on my, yesterday I was in Houston. I was in an office, a building, and I just did one right there holding it in my hand.
Right.
So,
it's a really good skill to have. I think that one thing as a creator, you can get caught up in like production value and trying to make it look perfect. And I think guys like, Peter Zehan with his geopolitical stuff, he does these talks where he's on his phone. They get a ton of views. He did one the other day it was hilarious. He did one the other day in his hotel room while he was like getting dressed to go give a speech, and he's like putting his tie on, and I'm like, wow, talk about being able to just get the message out, not worrying about it. I think the TikTok and the kids and all they've done with just a cell phone has really shown that like you don't need a big Hollywood movie studio. You can get a powerful message out, and it just, as long as the words are good, it can resonate.
And credit to my friend and colleague Tyson Culver, who's directed Juice, and he's the podcast producer for that Power Hungry podcast. He said, don't make them too precious. He said, just go outside. Don't hold on to them too hard. Don't make them too precious. And I take that to heart, although I will do sometimes, to get one that I like, I'll do 10, 12, 15 takes before I get one that I think I'm saying, because that headline, I'm started in newspapers a long time, more than 30 years ago. So I think in those headlines, what is the headline, right? And
Right.
if I have that headline to say, here's about it, hi everyone, here's about a minute on, I did one today on deindustrialization in Britain and warnings on power blackouts. And so, but that headline and that caption right in those first 5 or 10 seconds, if that's not right, I do it again, and then I'll do it again. I'll do it again until I get one that I think, okay, that sounds not stupid. It may not sound good, but it's just not stupid.
It's important. That's a formula. You got to get people draw them in. So it's formulaic. All right. That's just for me. That's my personal benefit. Sometimes when I get other content creators on, I like to ask those questions. Hopefully the listeners find value there, but I think it's interesting. Your recent book I read and I really enjoyed. And just one of the first question I think that would be interesting to hear you speak on is just how important energy and really electricity is to the world in terms of that stark difference between poverty and wealth. And like, I think you had a quote in there. It says, it doesn't guarantee having electricity or access to plentiful energy doesn't guarantee a country will be wealthy, but it almost guarantees that they won't be wealthy, or they will have poverty if they don't have access to that. So maybe just speak broadly to how important that is for listeners that may not understand how big of a deal it is.
Sure. Well, broadly, the availability of electricity is really the key difference between the rich countries and the poor. And as I said, as you said, electricity doesn't guarantee being, that countries will be rich, but if you don't have it, you are guaranteed to be poor. If we look at the world today, there are roughly 8 billion people in the world today. 4 out of 10 people, roughly around 3.5 billion people today, you live in countries where per capita electricity consumption is less than 1,000 kilowatt hours per year. So to put that into context, 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year, 1,000 kilowatt hours, that's about how much electricity my old kitchen refrigerator used. So there are 4 out of 10 people in the world today living in places where average consumption is less than what's used by an average kitchen refrigerator. This is the key disparity in the world today. When you look at the economies around the world, what is the difference between the rich and the poor? Yes, there are all these other things we can point to, but when it comes to energy and power, this is the key metric. And it's a very difficult one to bring the low, middle, and low income countries out of the dark. They have to do it themselves. We can't bring them out, right? They have to make this happen themselves. But if we're serious about bringing women and girls into modernity as well, electricity is the key commodity, because electricity frees them from the pump, the stove, and the wash tub. And this is something we saw very clearly in America, and particularly during the New Deal and the key architects of the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, George Norris, Burton Wheeler, Sam Rayburn, FDR. FDR was born rich, but Rayburn and Norris were not, and they were raised on rural farms, and they'd seen their mothers washing clothes by hand, and that was a key motivation for them to make rural electrification happen.
No, I love that part of the book. Super interesting. What are the biggest? I mean, it's a very loaded question. Just some of the biggest challenges, because you see countries that have done it very successfully. Is it chicken before the egg? Do they have to have things like stable governments and other things that can precede that? But it does seem like there are even some places that have a decent setup and they're not doing very well. If you had to break down some of the challenges to get that plentiful electricity, plentiful energy to some of these places that don't have it, what do you view as some of the key issues there?
Well, the first one is, as you point out, stable governments, civil society. Theft is the enemy of light, is one of the points I make in a question of power. If you have a corrupt government, if you have a corrupt system and people steal the electricity, the grid will not work. It may work for a little while, but eventually it will just be degraded and become tattered. We saw this in Iraq, a country that under Saddam Hussein, Saddam was a bad guy, but Saddam kept the lights on, and electricity consumption in Iraq during his tenure went up, and Iraq became a fairly prosperous country. Now he was a bad guy. Right. But as soon as Saddam was deposed and the U.S. kind of took over, and there was kind of this ragtag government, and electricity theft skyrocketed. And today the Iraqi grid is still in tatters. And when you look at other countries around the world where corruption is unfortunately rampant, like Lebanon, and I was in Beirut 7 years ago, corruption is everywhere, and the grid there doesn't work. And the same in Nigeria, another country where enormous mineral wealth in Nigeria, but the government and the system is just entirely corrupt, and the grid has never progressed there because the corruption is rampant. So the first thing that is required for electric grids to work is this continuing flows of capital into the grid to maintain it, to buy the fuel, to maintain the wires. And if you don't have that, the system just degrades very quickly.
Yeah. It's interesting because I had a content creator that's pretty big in the energy space, and he's more in traditional, he does a lot of capital market stuff. And he had made a comment on Twitter saying that the most important, issue in energy is decarbonization. And I don't want this to turn into talk about climate, but when he made that comment, he said the ship has already sailed. He goes, everybody wants this. It's the most important issue that we face. And I was kind of like,
No.
I don't know. I feel like energy poverty is a pretty big one. And when you say everybody wants this, like, are the people in the streets of Mumbai, do they want this? The people in Africa that don't have it, do they want this? I mean, how big of a problem
that's such an elitist attitude, Max. I don't know who you're talking about. I don't really care, but the rich countries can afford to talk about decarbonization. The poor countries don't. What is their immediate concern? It's to bring their people out of the dark and into modernity. Roger Pilkey Jr. coined the iron law of climate a long time ago, and it's exactly right. When policymakers or consumers are forced to choose between economic growth and action on climate, they will choose economic growth every time. I used his line, and I use I call it the iron law of electricity, which is people, businesses, and consumers, people, businesses, and countries will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. Full stop. I've seen it myself. I saw it in Beirut, where people pay the generator mafia. I saw it in India, where people steal electricity. I saw it in Louisiana, where people, after the hurricane, they will run a small generator. It doesn't matter to them how much it costs. I mean, it does matter to them, but they'll go buy gasoline and they'll run that thing because they want power. So is decarbonization their first priority? No, it's not. And to say it is just plain stupid. And I can't be more direct than that. It's stupid. It's elitist. And it ignores the reality in the world today. And it grinds my gears, grills my cheese to hear people talk like that, because it's so elitist.
Why don't you think it doesn't make as many headlines as you would think? Like, we had you got these people flying into Davos. What was that, 2 weeks ago, last week?
Sure.
And you hear so many just climate this, climate that, all these different, that's the main talking point. I just don't see the headlines on the energy poverty stuff. And the interesting thing you see some, but you're not seeing it nearly as much as these catastrophe headlines around climate. And what's interesting to me there is that, like, things like that, typically as a journalist, if it bleeds, it leads. If something's a catastrophe, if there's a huge problem, those are stories that may get play. But I see probably 20 times the amount of headlines about some type of climate catastrophe thing than I do about energy poverty or people that are facing these issues.
Sure.
Why do you think that is? Why is it not a big a deal as you and I know that it is? Why is it not being talked about as much?
Poor people don't make headlines. I mean, I think it's just that simple. Yeah. I read the New York Times sometimes, and I've read their coverage. I've read some recent coverage, and it just made me spitting mad, because the reporter it was about the rural resistance to the encroachment of wind and solar projects. And it's David Gellis, and he reported from Ohio about the resistance. And he made this reference. Oh, and there were anti-wind activists in the crowd who were affiliated with Koch-funded entities, right? Like the Koch brothers are all behind this rural resistance to the encroachment of these massive wind and solar projects. I emailed the guy twice. I said, where's the proof of this? Show me prove your claim, because that's a big claim. I called him out on Twitter, didn't reply. Well, but it all came clear to me a few days later. He put something on Twitter. He's in Davos. Well, so he's not, he lives in New York City. He doesn't give a flying F about the people in rural America. He doesn't live there. He doesn't know anyone there. He doesn't know any farmers, doesn't know any ranchers, doesn't know any rural county supervisors. I could put him in touch with 20 if he just, if he'd asked me. Well, here you go. Here's a list. But he's hanging in Davos because he's part of this, and let's call them what they are, the coastal elites. And they don't, he doesn't want to go talk to the rural merchant in Waco. Waco's not that rural, but Goldthwaite, Texas, or some small town in Iowa. That's of no interest to him. He's in Davos, and that's their crowd. And so, who does Davos? It's like the media reporting on the media. What does the media really love to report on? Themselves, because that's who they are.
Right.
But if they can hang out in Davos, well, they're part of the super elite because they're in Davos. And so these little people who don't want wind turbines or solar panels in their neighborhoods, oh, how dare them? Don't they understand climate change? Well, they understand climate change, but they understand their own property values and their own concerns more than they do the broader and very difficult issue of climate. And I'm not saying climate change isn't a concern. It's a concern. It's not our only concern.
Right. I don't have this on the agenda to bring it here, but I think it's a really interesting point. And you brought this up around the rural versus the urban people and how they live and their lifestyles. And I think one thing that's maybe under talked about, it's getting more traction on the renewable side, is just the massive amount of land use with these projects. And if you look at like localized pollution, take climate out of it and say, okay, if you got a bunch of, ice powered vehicles and they're smogging up a city, or you've got a power plant that burns coal and it's creating smog or whatever, that's, the urban people are going to feel this more. If you're just destroying, thousands and thousands of acres of farmland to put up solar panels and windmills and then importing that electricity into a city for EVs and all these other things, well, now one community is impacted at the benefit potentially of another community. And then they wonder why there's resistance to these projects. I've seen it here in Oklahoma. We have a ton of wind power, and you go down I-35 and in the Arbuckle Mountains, it's just this gorgeous drive that used to be just pristine. It's just covered. Even the mountains are covered in windmills.
Sure.
Oftentimes they're not spinning, but there does seem to be a weird dichotomy or like kind of this, balance here where it seems like it is almost rural versus the urban. Am I playing that up more than it is, or do you think that is something where they're exporting that to these rural communities?
No, I mean, you hit it exactly on the head, Max. And I've taken that same drive. And I'm born and raised in Tulsa. I'm from Oklahoma, and you look at the electoral college maps and you see, where do the Democrats get their votes? It's almost all in the cities, right? They carry very few rural counties. And you look across America, and those rural counties, they're heavily Republican. But I look at it. It's urban rural, but it's also a class divide, Max. And so the people who live in cities tend to be wealthier, and they love the idea of wind and solar, but they don't want to live near those projects. And so the class issue is around the fact that these big NGOs, climate NGOs, I don't call them environmental groups anymore because I don't think they're environmentalists. If they were, they wouldn't be promoting this landscape destroying, viewshed destroying sprawl that comes with wind and solar. But those are elitists. And I say that word with no joy, but it's the right word. They get all their money from the other people who live in the cities. Their supporters aren't in rural areas. And so it is a land grab. I mean, that's in fact what it is. And it is a land grab by big in many cases, multinational corporations against small town America, and trying to force them to accept wind and solar projects that they don't want. And, you said you work in the oil and gas industry. If ExxonMobil or Chevron was using the tactics that Mid-American Energy, that NextEra Energy, that Invenergy is using against small town America, it would be front page news in the New York Times.
Right.
Front page, but they will not cover it. And I'm calling out the New York Times and David Gellis and the reporting that they've done on this, and NPR, Julia Simons, has been atrocious. I mean, atrocious. Because it's this, idea of these rural rubes. They just don't know what's good for them. They're just so dumb, and it's the attitude that they use, I just find so disgusting. And I say that as somebody, I spend a lot of time in rural America. My people are the people who turn wrenches. Those are the people that I admire. And those are the people who work. And for them to fight for their neighborhoods, of course they are. You think they're stupid? I mean, but that's the attitude that a lot of these big media outlets, the reporting they do on these land use conflicts, which are the binding constraint on the growth of renewables, it's like they just can't comprehend why these people would not want 600-foot wind turbines in their yard. I mean, it's dumb.
Yeah, it is. No, I'm glad you bring it up. I mean, I have a group that I know that does a lot of regulatory work, and they do a lot of consulting for primarily oil and gas groups around environmental consulting and dealing with communities that they impact, where operations are at. And I asked them, I said, so I guess you must be getting a lot of work and a lot of interest from renewables companies because of how massive their footprint is, especially locally, in terms of the environment that they're impacting. And they're like, actually, no, we're really not. We're not getting much of any work from them. And I said, well, it's because you're affiliated with oil and gas. And they're like, no, honestly, it just doesn't feel like they're up against the same scrutiny that the oil and gas companies are up against, even though their impact is so big. And it just seems like, given the push and the amount of money that's behind these projects, they're just not being put under the same scrutiny as, say, a new natural gas field or a new oil field that was going to get drilled, and the amount of regulatory hurdles and just scrutiny they would be put under. Do you think that's fair? I mean, it just seems like it's kind of the Wild West in the renewable side.
Well, I can't speak to that land use planning consulting part of it, but I can speak to the money, and follow the money. So this Inflation Reduction Act, the subsidies for wind and solar, when you count them, what were the existing ones, and you add in the $125 billion or so, 226 billion that was added under the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, the wind and solar industries stand to collect between now and 2030 roughly $240 billion. So when you get those kind of subsidies, and this includes offshore wind for the investment tax credit, the production tax credit, but these big projects, the companies that are pushing these, like Invenergy, like NextEra, like Mid-American, and many others, right? Some of the big utilities, the amount of money they stand to make, Cypress Creek Renewables, which is trying to inflict a solar project on the town of Cambria, New York, even though the town has been opposed to it all along, unanimous votes by the town board, 3050. Fought this project off in 2019. Cypress Creek Renewables, owned by a Swedish company, trying to force this town to take a solar project they don't want. And why is that? Because the tax credits are so valuable. And so that's what's driving all this. It's the money. Follow the money. And so there's just a vast amount of money behind these big corporate interests in the NGOs and the banks and the law firms to make these projects, force them onto rural communities. And that's the binding constraint. And as I show in the rural rejection database, I'll stop here. It's on my website, robertbryce.com. Last year alone, across the U.S., 79 solar projects were rejected. The total number of solar rejections in the U.S. is now over 100 since 2017. The number of wind projects rejected across the country from Maine to Hawaii since 2015 on the order of 270. So this is not new. It's not novel. It's been ongoing for a long time, but you won't read about it in the New York Times. And you certainly won't read about it in National Public Radio or Washington Post. They won't cover it because their reporters don't give a shit about it.
Right. This is I love a lot of things you said there, and I could go into a bunch of different angles with this.
And I get pissed off. You can tell.
Well, no, it's good. I'm like writing down clips I'm going to make out of this because they're good. I'm writing down the timestamps because I always forget afterwards. But the thing that this is a question I'm going to ask you, and I've thought about this long and hard, and I want you to think about it in a multifaceted way. Is the energy transition really happening? Is this a real thing, or is this a marketing ploy? And when I ask you that, I'll throw out just a couple things and I'll lead you a little bit. For example, if you look at the total energy mix that's moved away from fossil fuels into these quote unquote renewables, it hasn't made much of a dent. We spent something like 3.7 trillion globally in the last 20 years. If you look at areas that have had the highest penetration of these technologies, like Germany, and then them shutting down their nuclear plants in the name of transitioning or going green, they're now burning a lot of coal. When I look around at the world, I see a lot of money. I see a lot of marketing. I see a lot of hype in news, but I don't really see the objectives of what this transition is supposed to be doing actually unfolding. So is the energy transition real? Is it really happening?
I think it's a marketing term. Meredith Engwin, she makes the point about renewables. She said it's a marketing term. And when you look at the numbers, and I've studied the numbers, and I pride myself on my research and the numbers, not my numbers, the numbers, the BP statistical review. I just gave a presentation on this yesterday in Houston. In 2021, the amount of an increase in hydrocarbons was nearly 5 times the rate of growth in solar and wind combined. In the United States in 2021, just the growth in oil consumption in the U.S. was about 5 times the total growth in wind and solar combined. When you do it on a par basis, on an exajoule basis, and these are numbers from the BP statistical review, not my numbers, the numbers. Right. So this whole idea about the energy transition, I look at it and I say, show me the proof that there's energy transition going on? Yes, we are changing some of the electricity mix, and the amount of nat gas and coal that we're burning has declined, and some of that has been taken up by solar and wind. That's clear. But electricity, in terms of final energy use, final consumption, final energy use, electricity is a relatively small part of the pie. And so, and I say that it's globally, it's around 20% or 30% of total energy end use consumption. In the US, it's a little bit higher than that, if memory serves. So we are changing some of the electricity mix, but overall, no, it's not happening. And yet this is the term that everyone talks about, speeding up the energy transition. And I'm looking at them saying, go slowly, because I'm from Oklahoma here. I don't see it.
Yeah, I don't see it either. And I've tried a lot to look at the data and to talk to the experts, and I don't see it. I see a lot of these projects getting pushed forward, and I think having some untold, unexpected, or I think some people would expect them, but some unintended consequences to the grid. Your point around follow the money. If you look at this, we have the technology, and this is a thing, another almost like paradoxical aspect of this. We have the technology today to rapidly decarbonize if we wanted to. We have nuclear energy.
Sure.
We have natural gas. We have things that are baseload technologies that can provide steady and reliable energy. And those are not just being not utilized; they're being actively, people are actively lobbying against or trying to shut those things down, shutting down nuclear plants, trying to stop new natural gas infrastructure. What do you think how this plays out? Do you think that the grid is going to continue to get weaker? Meredith is a great voice in this space, but what are some of the unexpected consequences if we keep going down this path?
Well, I think all we need to do is look at what's happening in Europe, Max. It's very clear. I testified before the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee in November of 2021. And I said, this was before Russia invaded Ukraine. I said, the U.S. should not follow Europe's lead. And what has Europe done? They've committed to, I borrowed, what is that line? Amateurs borrow, professionals steal. Well, I'm stealing everywhere. Right. Everywhere I look. Meredith Angwin's line is the fatal trifecta. Well, I coined the fatal quadfecta, what has happened in Europe? What has Europe done? They've overinvested in renewables, underinvested in hydrocarbons. They've closed their coal and nuclear plants, and they've become too reliant on imports. And that's put their entire economy in the ditch. And remember, their economy was headed toward the ditch before Putin invaded Ukraine. There were fertilizer plants, metal producers in Europe were shutting down before the invasion of Ukraine. Now, the invasion of Ukraine made the problem worse, but what was happening in the months before the invasion, wind droughts across Europe. They had a lot of still days, no wind energy production, and so they were having to burn more gas. And then Putin invades Ukraine in February at a time when Europe was very vulnerable because they'd consumed so much natural gas. They didn't have much in storage, and this was one of the end results. But I guess I think about it this way, Max, is that we're looking at the issue of climate change, and we're looking at the possibility and maybe the reality of more extreme weather, hotter, colder, more extremes for longer.
Right.
Well, it's the height of absolute idiocy, or the depth of the idiocy, I don't know which, to make our most important energy and power network dependent on the weather. It's like, no, damn it. We need energy. We need weather resistant systems. And that should be the goal. And that's why I've been so adamantly pro-nuclear, natural gas to nuclear. I've been saying the same thing for 13 years. I'm probably going to say it for the next 13 years till I turn blue in the face. But this is the obvious way forward if we want to achieve decarbonization.
Yeah. No, that's the part that kills me, is that we have tech today that can do it. The U.S. has been doing it with natural gas, nuclear. Nuclear reminds me a lot of the space race. It's like we had this technology, we're putting people on the moon in the 60s. And then now, what have we, yes, we built some fancy telescopes, but we've kind of stopped in terms of some of the innovation there. And same with nuclear. It's like we had this tech, and it just seems like it comes back down to these policymakers. And I'll argue with people I think you've already answered this question earlier, but I've argued with people around. They say, well, these people are either ignorant or they're actively trying to destroy everything. And I'm like, I don't think it's either one. I think that they're not ignorant. I don't think they're trying to destroy things. I think that they just are, there's special interests and lobby groups that it's like you said, follow the money, right? I mean, why is all this stuff being pushed forward when we know that we have superior technology that's readily available today, that we don't have to really make any new meaningful innovations? I mean, new innovations in nuclear would be great, but we have it all today. So putting it back to you, is it just these policymakers that are following the money versus doing what they're actually saying they should be doing, which is decarbonizing?
Well, I think some of it is legacy of the democratic politics in America that have been in place for decades. And specifically, that the Democratic Party has been opposed to the oil and gas industry since the 40s. And I can point you to this, right? That this is something that this is part of party politics. And further, that they have been anti-nuclear. And I'm saying they, the Democrats. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a partisan. I'm disgusted, right? But that for 48 years, since the early 1970s, the Democrats in their political platform would never say anything positive about nuclear energy. They changed that in 2020, and we made some positive noise in their platform about nuclear energy. But 48 years of being opposed to nuclear energy, or being silent, or the only things that they mentioned that nuclear is mentioned in the Democratic Party platform is on nuclear weaponry, nuclear terrorism, nuclear proliferation, nothing about nuclear energy. So this is a long-standing stance of the left in America. And I think, we can, to simplify the thing, the left, the Democratic Party, this has been their credo for decades. And so it's not reasonable to expect they're going to pivot and do so quickly. But if we're serious, and that's the big word, if we're serious about reducing emissions and trying to address the issue of climate change, which is a very difficult problem, particularly given the rise of China and India and their amount of coal use and the rest of it, we have to get serious about nuclear. And the U.S. could lead in theory, but there are a lot of impediments, including the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which could take up a whole nother hour if you want to go down that path, because the NRC has become an intractable part of the problem here, I think, in terms of new nuclear development in the United States.
How much it would be a great hour to talk about. And I've had a couple guests on that have done a good job on that, but how much of like what energy we use today has been based off of the natural competitiveness of the market in products that are bringing us a benefit to our life, and how much of it is based on the regulatory frameworks that are put in place? I've had people on the renewable side say the only reason everything isn't renewables today is because all these, corrupt corporations and politicians have rigged the system in favor of fossil fuels.
And they bought the patents on the batteries, and we would have had all this solved, except there was a conspiracy in place.
Yeah.
The conspiracy is of just basic physics, Max. I've been in the reporting business. I sold my first article now 35 years ago. I've been in the journalism trade for a long time. I used to, I was on the left. I came from the left, right? That was part of my background, right? Now I think I'm very much a centrist, but in all that time, all these claims about, there's a conspiracy and, the oil companies, big bad. Look, the reason we use oil is if oil didn't exist, we would have to invent it. It is a miracle substance. I mean, when it comes to energy density, the scale of the production and consumption, ease of use, ease of handling, time to refuel, it's an amazing thing. I mean, we go to the gas station, everybody complains, it costs $3. Well, hell, it's cheaper than milk. I mean, and yet you can put a gallon in your tank and run your car and travel 20 miles or maybe more. I mean, it's such an incredible bargain. And so why do we use hydrocarbons? Why have coal, oil, and natural gas predominated since the days of Edison? And Edison burned coal in the Pearl Street power plant in Lower Manhattan in 1882. Coal still accounts for 36% of all global electricity production today, 140 years later. Why is that? It's because it can provide the scale of the energy services that we want at prices consumers can afford. Full stop. That's it. And it's because of the inherent energy density of the fuels themselves. There's natural gas, coal, and oil, and we could talk about uranium. That energy density in those substances and the power density, that is the physical footprint that the production of those fuels requires, is so much greater in terms of leverage than what you get from renewables, which goes back to the land use issue and therefore the material intensity and these other things that we talked about. But it's a conspiracy of physics and scale. There's no conspiracy of some evil capitalists and, Lee Raymond and the, Chevrons of the world getting together and saying, we're going to fix this system and we're going to get all the money ourselves. No, it's bullshit. Yeah. It's not true.
I thought it was because Reagan took the solar panels off the White House.
I don't know. Well, that was definitely.
I'm joking, but someone said that. Someone that I interviewed who's a passionate environmentalist, they were like, it goes back, and they were bringing up Reagan and the solar panels, and I'm like, this is not why we use these products. We use these products because they make our lives better,
right?
And because they're the best products to use. Do you think that like the energy crisis and what's happened this last year is going to change anything at the policy level? I think it maybe is a little bit, but what do you think, like the recent events, you've lived through a lot and reported on a lot in the energy world. Do you see some of the stuff happening recently having any material change, or is it going to be par for the course and the existing talking points moving forward?
Well, it's been disappointing, frankly, to see how the Biden administration has responded, or lack of response, to what's happened in Europe. I mean, Europe is providing the object example of what not to do. And yet the response from this administration is, oh, well, let's follow the European model still. So that, frankly, has been disappointing. But at the same time, I think you look at what is happening regardless of the policies, right? And so you see what has been a real resurgence of interest in nuclear in Europe. Britain pushing full speed ahead with Rolls-Royce potentially on SMR that could have power density of 10,000 watts per square meter, 10,000 times greater than the power density of wind energy, 1,000 times greater than the power density of solar. That's promising. And then you see countries across Eastern Europe, Estonia, Poland, Germany, well, forget Germany, several other countries saying we're going to embrace nuclear fission, and we're looking at different technologies and embracing those. Or Japan going back and saying we're going to extend the life of our existing reactors, and we are looking to build new ones. South Korea, the same. Abu Dhabi switching on the Al Baraka nuclear plant. The Chinese saying, yes, we're going to expand our nuclear fleet and do it rapidly. These are things that I think are very positive that are happening globally, that are outside of the Washington Beltway, that are things that are moving rapidly partly because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, partly because of concern about climate change, partly a concern because hydrocarbons have gone up in price. The price of coal is up 6x since the mid 2020. So these are just, I think, this realpolitik, to use that line or that word, injecting itself very strongly into global energy markets. And that's leading to a resurgence in interest in nuclear power. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I agree. You made this point earlier around some of these things coming down to partisan divides. I had a buddy of mine who's pretty left leaning, and I have a lot of friends that are left leaning, and we talk, we may not agree on everything, and I try to view myself as more of a centrist as well. But he sent me some, either a TikTok or a video about Joe Biden actually not being hard on oil and gas because of some of the things that he's done. And my response back to him was, well, it seems like he's hard on the U.S. oil and gas industry. I mean, he's out here talking to Iran and Venezuela and these other countries. He's out here pumping a lot of oil out of the SPR. I mean, it's not like if he really wanted oil to go, for there to be less oil production, they wouldn't be pushing a bunch of stored oil out into the marketplace. But is it that the Democrats are really anti-oil and gas, or are they just anti the U.S. industry because that's where the politics lie?
I would say that the second one, I'm going to stay away from that question because it'd be too much speculation, I think. But it is clear that this is the most anti-hydrocarbon presidential administration in my lifetime. The Obama administration made a lot of noises, but Obama was actually pretty good to the oil and gas industry. This is the Biden administration. Remember, they shut down federal leasing. They've used the SPR as a piggy bank to try and bring oil prices down, while all the time bad mouthing the oil and gas industry. And I've thought about this a lot, Max, that look, it's easy to bash the oil and gas industry, and yet I see what is happening is what I call an asymmetric fight. And you have I wrote a piece on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, last week on the billionaires behind the gas bans. And so I started looking at GuideStar and some of these NGOs, these climate focused NGOs, and how much money they have. They're so far outspending the oil and gas associations by a factor of at least 3-1. And the numbers are actually far greater than that. But they have the advantage. These NGOs, the climate activists, the Sierra Club, NRDC, why is it an advantage? Why are they fighting an asymmetric war? All they have to do is get policy enacted, like go to the city of Berkeley and have Berkeley, California ban the use of natural gas. Well, that's a policy win for them. Then they can go to their funders and say, see, we got this policy in place, give us some more money. Whereas the energy producers, whether they're producing electricity or oil and gas or coal, they have to deliver molecules and electrons, regardless of the policy. They have to make sure that they can deliver it. So that's a far different fight. If all you have to do is work in the policy realm over here, whereas in this other side, you have to deal in the physical world, and you have to make these things move, and you have to dig them out of the ground. You have to send them over wires or through pipelines. That's a much harder fight, a much more difficult fight. And they're getting their butts kicked. I mean, they're just getting, they're losing so badly. I think they don't know what happened. And it's very clearly been a lavishly funded campaign by the NGOs to outlaw the use of natural gas. They have billions of dollars behind them. They have the media and the momentum, and the oil and gas industry. And I think the electric utilities, they've all been backfooted, and they're like, damn, what happened? Yeah. The answer is you get your ass kicked and you don't know how to respond.
Right. Well, and that's a great talking point we can move to. But the only reason I brought that up is because it seems like, when he's sitting here, I mean Biden sitting here begging OPEC to produce more or doing, policies that will lower the cost.
Or the Venezuelans. He's going to the narco, Nicolas Maduro, and asking them to produce more oil and produce more oil. Are you out of your mind?
Right.
I mean, I thought I was reading this in The Onion. I mean, you're going to the Saudis and on bended knee after all this time. You're fist bumping with Prince, what's his name, who's dismembered Khashoggi. I mean, it's like, what are you really doing? I mean, it's almost beyond measure in terms of how callous it is. I mean, and truly, and I say this with no pleasure, but you're going to kneecap the domestic industry, and you're going to go to a narco and ask them to produce PDVSA, which has already been gutted, and ask them to produce more oil. I mean, it's hard to make it up.
Well, that's why I was saying it. Yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm saying it's like, it's anti-oil and gas when it comes to your domestic and political rivals and enriching that industry. But it's pro oil and gas whenever the prices are high at the pump, and you'll do anything other than help your political rivals, help, quite frankly, the country, because it's based here domestically. We can produce it. It helps jobs, helps all these things. But you'd rather go beg from these people that are bad actors versus helping people here domestically. The gas stove thing is a big head scratcher to me. I have a friend who is also, I would say, more left leaning. He's very into the energy transition, super smart guy, engineer. And he was messaging me saying, he's like, I think I can prove it with math that, natural gas stoves are actually better for the environment just because of how inefficient electric stoves are. And he's like, I'm thinking about writing a piece on this. He goes, I don't think it's even an opinion. He goes, I think we can objectively show, and he's all for electrification. He's a big proponent of the energy, transition, quote unquote, like we talked about earlier. He's doing a lot of things in that space, but he was even being like, this just doesn't make any sense. He's like, natural gas stoves are great. They're super efficient. That's just has to be, people have to look at this, right, and think this is an obvious political attack. But do you think this stuff is working? Are people really being fooled by this? I mean, clearly this is just being pushed for political reasons.
Well, no doubt. And so when you look at natural gas consumption in the United States, since 1970, when I was 10 years old, residential natural gas consumption in the United States has not changed. It was 5 trillion cubic feet a year when I was 10 years old, and it's 5 trillion cubic feet a year when I'm 62 years old. Right. And so why are they focusing their attack on residential use of gas? Well, I think this is look, I mean, try and step back and think about it from a pure politics or a strategy standpoint. Well, that's a much easier fight, right? If you could just go after residential instead of you're going to go after the entire gas industry in the utility sector, right? Because we're burning 11 or 12 trillion cubic feet of gas per year for power burn. Well, that's a harder fight because then you're going up a lot of vested interests, a lot of incumbent utilities who have a lot of money to fight back. You go against the residential sector, well, then you just make the gas stove. You start with the gas stove and then you expand it from there. I think it's an easier political fight, and I think I'm talking solely about what are the tactics here? How do you fight a battle that you can probably win? And that's where I think that comes from. But further, the gas stove issue. Natural gas consumption at the burner tip on your stove accounts for 0.4% of all U.S. natural gas use. And yet this guy, Taylor Grunwald from our Rocky Mountain Institute says, oh, natural gas, the stove emissions these are a key part of the climate change. These are a key contributor to climate emission, climate change. Like, come on. I mean, this is not even serious. This is just, it's a laugh line. You can't say that with a straight face and expect to be taken seriously. It's a joke, but
yeah,
this is part of the cultural divide as well. And so you have these massively funded NGOs working on multi-$100 million budgets, including RMI, over $140 million a year, pushing these campaigns. And give them credit. They've been incredibly successful.
Yeah, they have. And I think that you're right earlier about the industry getting their ass kicked on the messaging and stuff. Oh. And it's just disappointing to see the amount of pandering. There's certain organizations that have leaned in. Energy Transfer, who's a midstream and infrastructure group, they do a lot of good messaging on their social media about the benefits of oil and gas. And they, really are getting more aggressive, kind of saying, no, we're not going to pander to the narrative. That's just one that comes to mind on top of my head. But it's tough on social media. Like there's a guy that's they always have the same background. It's either windmills or it's that little chart with the red and the blue lines showing climate getting hotter or whatever. And they have climate in their bio, but they have these huge followings on social media. And a guy did a thread on gas stoves, basically saying they're killing everybody and it's killing children and all these things. And it had I don't know, when I looked at it, it was at 15,000 likes on the top tweet. And so all the tweets, he probably had 6, figures worth of likes. And it's you don't even want to argue with it because you're like, this is just, not even any point in getting into that. It's better to do this kind of content and talk about it long form. But it just seems like it's incredibly popular. It seems like the younger generation is buying it, everything, hook, line, and sinker. I had an Uber driver, and it was in New York, and I was taking an Uber, and he's like, why are all the corporate greed and the gas prices are so high? They're just gouging us, right? They're gouging us with corporate greed. And I'm like, no, they're not. This is a worldwide commodity. What are you talking about? It seems like it's working. What do we do? Is it just more stuff like this, or how does the industry respond? It just doesn't seems like an uphill battle.
Well, of the questions, I've been doing this for a long time, right? My first book was on Enron and it came out more than 20 years ago. Now that's my first book. I've written 6 since then. And in the time that I've been doing this and doing public speaking, I do a lot of public speaking engagements. I get this question of, well, how do we change the discussion? How do we get people to be more realistic about our energy and power systems? And I'm not saying, that it's how do we defeat the renewables are growing. There's no doubt about it. But it sounds like a joke, and I say it I'm not trying to be flip. It's pack a lunch. What's your strategy? Pack a lunch, because this fight, this effort to educate the general public and the policymakers is going to take a very long time. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to change things overnight. It's just like the shape of our energy and power systems have been shaped over now more than a century. When Spindletop was discovered, in 1901, that's 122 years ago. Oil gradually became the motivational force in our transportation sector, and streetcars and trains were largely supplanted by diesel engines and autocycle engines, right? But that took decades. Anything moving away from that will also take decades. So in terms of what I do and what I try and do is I just pound the physics and I pound the math and I keep saying the same things over and just trying. And I think that some of the narrative is changing. I think the narrative around nuclear energy is changing. I see a changing of the guard, changing a lot of sentiment, because younger people like Maddie Hilly with the campaign for a new nuclear deal, for a green nuclear deal, Paris Ortiz Wines, Mark Nelson, Emmett Penny, Chris Kiefer in Canada, a younger crowd. I mean, I say younger than me because I'm an old guy now, right? But people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who are looking at nuclear and embracing it in a new way. And I think that that's very positive and something that to me is incredibly encouraging. So the battle isn't lost. The battle is difficult and it's going to take time, but there is progress, I think, and rationality. You see the backlash on this and this gas stove ban. How quickly Biden in fact disavowed it and said, "Oh, I'm not opposed." The White House immediately weighs in and said, "No, no, 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 no. We don't want to be seen on the wrong side of this." That was incredible to me in terms of them understanding the politics of these fuel choices and the coercive effects of a lot of this policy that's trying to be implemented by these unaccountable NGOs.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that last point up here on the politics side. This is something that I struggle with. I don't love being super political. I really am not that passionate about politics in general. I think it's all kind of a joke. I rarely watch political news. I just don't care very much for it. I think a lot of it's kind of just, it's theater, and I don't love politicians. But in the energy topic, it seems like you can't get away from it. And one of the motivations of making my podcast more broad and being able to have different discussions is honestly, I got a little exhausting every week, sometimes multiple times a week, getting pulled into that political domain. Is that just inherent with energy? It's always going to have this politics. Like, it just seems like you can't get away from it. I think I know the answer, but it just seems like that's where it always lies with this
well,
stuff.
it's all the demagoguery around it can be infinite, right? Because the public and the policymakers don't really know what is right. And this is a symptom, I think, of the fact that overwhelmingly the general public and our policymakers are scientifically illiterate and innumerate. And so they can demagogue about these issues forever. So, those evil oil companies. Oh, well, we should all drive electric cars. And why don't we? Well, why don't we? Because the electric car still stinks. I mean, I'm sorry. I've driven a Tesla. I get it. It's fast. It's a luxury car. I get it. It's nice. And yes, the sales are growing, but it's a luxury vehicle. It's for the Benz and Beamer crowd still. And they've been in the marketplace for 100 years. And yet, I think last year they accounted for something less than 5% of all new car sales. Okay, they're growing, but after 100 years, you're still only at 5%. I mean,
Right.
Let's get real. And now you suddenly think by 2030, Britain is going to outlaw the internal combustion engine in new vehicles. Same with California. And suddenly you're going to prohibit consumers from purchasing the car that and the vehicle types that they've been buying now for decades because, well, climate change. Well, okay, yes, but what about personal freedom? What about personal consumer choice? What about,
Right.
the low income consumer who can't afford the Tesla? All these things are being ignored because of this singular focus on climate change. Climate change is a concern. It's not our only concern.
Yeah. Well, and I think that climate, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, I've seen a bigger shift, and I've been in the energy industry for 13 years. And I remember when I got in, it was early days in the shale revolution, early-ish days. And I was working up in the Northeast in my first internship. And it was all water contamination, fracking. I mean, all the main headlines were about that. And then I've really seen, I don't see a lot of that anymore. I think the oil and gas industry does do a pretty good job. Now, yes, if there's a pipeline that has a spill, it's going to get a lot of press. And rightfully so. We shouldn't be hurting local environments, but it just seems like now that they've moved to climate, this is just kind of this ongoing omnipotent boogeyman that is going to be 1,000-year problem. So we're going to be able to talk about it forever. It just seems like a tactic shift. And I don't know, you do the reporting more. Is there not as much on the local pollution stuff as there used to be, or is that just my perception of it? It seems like now it's almost exclusively climate, whereas I used to see a lot more stories, I feel like, on like local impact, things like that with oil and gas.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily the right one to ask on that, I guess. But I will say that it's very clear that the amount of money opposed to new hydrocarbon infrastructure of any kind, there's just almost an infinite amount of money aligned with those groups who want to prevent the construction of new pipelines, particularly like into New England, for instance, right? So that's one reason why power and gas prices in New England are so high. The same with California. So the land use issues around renewables and high voltage transmission are also there for any kind of new hydrocarbon infrastructure. And so I think there's just simply no doubt that these climate focused NGOs, and they are going to spend whatever it takes to prevent the construction of any new hydrocarbon infrastructure. And they are going to find a lot of willing people to help them in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're reaching the end of the hour here. Talk about some of these new projects you have going on. If you can talk about it,
Sure.
You mentioned filming some new movies and things like that.
Sure. Well, first, subscribe to me on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. I've gone to Substack just recently and really like the way that platform has evolved and have had great success or great traction with my latest piece called The Billionaires Behind the Gas Bans. So check that out on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. I've also recently updated the renewable rejection database, which is on my website, robertbryce.com. You can look at it there. I'm happy with that. It took a lot of work and some great help from Brian Gitt and some other colleagues in updating it and making it searchable by state, by year, by keyword. So that's much more powerful, more robust database than it was before. Power Hungry Podcast. I'm a podcaster like you, Max, and have great fun doing it. Lots of interesting guests, and I'm also working on a new film with my colleague Tyson Culver called Burning Down the Grid, which we'll have more to talk about in another month or two. So yeah, there's plenty going on.
Awesome. Well, for everybody that hasn't checked Robert's stuff out, it's amazing. I love your books are great. I've only read one, but I've got some other queued up for I usually listen. I do a lot of Audible. I find it's easier for me, but I've got some others queued up, and I just want to say, I appreciate the work that you're doing. There needs to be more voices like yours. And it's an education thing at the end of the day. Get people are out there, young people, they want to learn, they want to absorb. I didn't have all these resources when I was, I'm only 36. And when I was 22, 23, I couldn't just pop on a podcast and figure this stuff out. I couldn't listen to the amazing resources that are out there today. So just want to say thank you for that, and keep that up, and everybody go check it out. And Robert, appreciate you coming on.
Well, that's very kind, Max. I appreciate it. And tell all your listeners on the books, you don't have to read my books. You just have to buy them. So that's
there you go.
Keep that in mind.
There you go. All right, guys. Thank you. Until next time.